Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from Wetbread, who asked, "Hey Thor, do you think it actually makes sense to read comic books or books based on Star Wars when any director can retcon anything in a Disney Plus series?" And well, the short answer to that question, assuming you're reading the books and or comics primarily because you want to sort of keep up with the canon and not just because you're thoroughly enjoying reading them somehow, well, in that case, the answer is no. There's not much of a point or reason, or it doesn't make too much sense to read them because they're absolutely not canon in the same way, say, the movies or shows are. It seems pretty clear they can simply be retconned or ignored, or that they're just not on the same level of canon, despite the promise that was made when the old expanded universe was discontinued, that everything, be it movie, show, book, game, comic book, or whatever, that it was all going to be canon and in the exact same universe. Which, as I've talked about before, was the main reason why, at the time, I was, I don't want to say okay with discontinuing it, but I at least kind of understood their reasoning and was pretty excited for something that I thought was, if we're being completely honest, it would maybe be more, shall we say, kind of consistent overall and more planned out than the EU ever was. Which isn't to say they did a horrible job in that department. They actually did quite well when you consider George Lucas himself would kind of change things that they'd have to adapt to in the EU. But I figured that the formation of the Lucasfilm Story Group, that it meant a whole new level of quality, continuity, and consistency when it came to the new canon. That it might also be a bit more discerning, I guess you could say, with what it lets into the canon. Because to be blunt about it, there is some weird shit in the EU, and a fun video someday might be the top 10 crazy things the EU added to Star Wars. Though now in the new canon, and mainly thanks to the comic books, just how many there are, and the fact that a lot of them keep using the same characters over and over, and generally the main original trilogy characters get used a lot. Well, now there's absolutely plenty of pretty dumb or pointless stuff as well in the new canon. Plus, it just feels like these main characters like Luke, Leia, Darth Vader, that they have an adventure every single day of the week, every week. Like nearly every free moment of time between the films has been filled in with some kind of crazy or silly adventure. And more often than not, they don't feel like they, shall we say, kind of jive or fit in with the films. Like I couldn't imagine seeing the things that are on the pages of a comic book actually happen in a movie. That they'd be out of place or just wouldn't work if I saw them on screen. Some would even be downright laughable on screen. And yes, I know they're comic books, and it's generally a medium that is thought of as being a bit more extravagant, if you will, especially when it comes to, say, Marvel and superhero type books. But personally, I'd take something more toned down and quote-unquote boring over what we generally get out of them nowadays. Something that it feels like it fits more with the films rather than, well, what many think of when they think of comic books at being over-the-top kind of adventures. Not to mention we know nothing can really happen to the main characters in these comics, or that nothing all that major can happen in general in the Star Wars universe during these time periods that they're in. And I'm by no means saying books and comics should be required reading for the films or shows or anything like that. I think there's a very fine line between required and relevant when it comes to these sort of things. I'm just saying nothing important can happen because it conflicts with what we already know about the time period. I mean, they try to make it seem like cool and important stuff is happening. They also always have these kind of silly gimmicks like comic books do. For example, teasing Han was married once before he met Leia and eventually giving that character he supposedly married and that no one really cares about, giving her her own series. They also do stuff like Luke having a yellow lightsaber for a little while after The Empire Strikes Back. But it just feels so out of place and forced that, again, my mind can't or won't sort of rectify it with the films, or it just doesn't want to think he had another saber before he built his green one. It's like it detracts from the main story rather than adds to it, which I think is actually the root of the problem. What they're doing always feels like it's adding on to rather than an actual part of, if that makes sense. Or worse yet, it's reactionary to something dumb a film did that now needs to somehow be explained and only makes things worse. The book Shadow of the Sith is an example of this. It's an example of trying to make sense of the films, but only making things more silly and kind of convoluted. And speaking of the books, in general, they're a little better than the comics, but not always better, especially when they deal with, again, the sort of main characters and main storylines where they have virtually no flexibility to do anything. But they do usually, and I stress usually, they do show more restraint and are just more interesting or more worthwhile feeling when you read them. Especially when they don't deal with the main characters. And some of them, like the Thrawn books, for example, have been really, really good, and I highly recommend them. However, the problem with them not being reactionary or kind of added after the fact and by default being kind of embedded into the story is that they likely won't have any bearing on what the films or shows will do, like in the case of Thrawn with the upcoming Ahsoka series from Dave Filoni. I highly doubt, given Filoni's track record with paying attention to the books and comics, that the 2 trilogies worth of books in the new canon written by Timothy Zahn about Thrawn, that they will have anything at all to do with the show, despite dealing quite a bit with a species known as the Grisk, and they've been built up in the books to be this big, huge threat that Thrawn even ended up joining the Empire to see if the Empire could kind of eventually help stop. And I can't help but feel like that'll be ignored by Filoni in the upcoming Ahsoka series in favor of whatever he wants to do with Thrawn. That it'll have whole new motivations that won't have anything to do with the Grisk or what has been built up in 6 books across multiple years and across 2 trilogies. And though, yeah, I enjoyed reading the Thrawn books, which you could certainly make an argument is the most important part. Did I enjoy my time reading them? Yes, so I should just be happy. But there's still a part of me that feels like, what was the point of reading them if they're not a part of everything else that they're supposed to be? And that's especially the case when the books or comics that you read just are plain bad, which happens quite a bit in the new canon, especially, again, with the comic books. They have been the worst offenders of pretty, again, out there and weird stories that really don't need to be told. And it all really makes me wonder, if these stories are likely going to be ignored anyway, why did they ever bother disbanding or discontinuing the expanded universe? Why not just let it keep going under the Legends banner? And when it comes to the new canon, they could publish less of them to make them feel more special and maybe be a bit more, again, kind of discerning with what they let into the new canon, instead of including all this random stupid stuff for the writers and directors of the shows and movies to simply ignore anyway. I mean, the argument might be they don't want to confuse people or fans as to what is in which canon, but the thing is that, as I was just saying, all reprinted EU stuff comes with a Legends banner on it anyway. And yeah, they are reprinting virtually all of the old books, so what does it matter if it's a new book or an old book if it has the Legends banner on it? Not to mention, if you are someone who reads the books or comics, which is a small minority of the fan base, you probably already understand the difference between the Legends and EU and the new canon, or you'll put in the little bit of time and effort it will require to figure out where which book or which comic goes. In other words, canceling the expanded universe was about the dumbest thing they could have ever done and served no purpose whatsoever. There's no reason it couldn't have run alongside the new canon, and then fans who had been keeping up with the expanded universe for decades wouldn't have been pissed off by what was essentially the very first major thing Disney did with Star Wars, that being discontinue the EU. And that all now brings us to the High Republic era, or project, which I think was partially Lucasfilm realizing how irrelevant a lot of their books and comics were. That they figured out that if they had a virtually blank canvas to work with, they could create their own sort of main characters and important stories and events. In other words, they could do whatever they wanted with the characters they create. They're not attached to other characters or other major events and things. And they could do whatever they wanted, more or less, with the whole time period. But one of the main problems is they picked going back a couple hundred years before the prequels, which is a time period that's kind of always been assumed to be pretty boring, or not a whole lot happened on the galactic scale. Not saying nothing happened, but certainly there were no Sith or anything along those lines to contend with. And so they've had to manufacture these new and different threats or enemies or antagonists, which, don't get me wrong, is not a bad idea. It's not what I dislike, but what they've come up with hasn't been the most exciting. Especially in the second phase, which is about halfway through right now and takes place over 100 years before the first phase. And I gotta say, I've been pretty bored with the second phase after actually liking the first phase for the most part. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly had some pretty dumb stuff as well. Not to mention too many characters and the Drenger, those were the plant monsters, if you're wondering. They felt like extra stuff added for no reason whatsoever that just got dealt with and they moved on from it. Anyway, yeah, the first phase was pretty good all around, or at least enjoyable enough where I didn't feel like reading it was a chore that I do simply to keep myself in the know when it comes to all things Star Wars. But the second phase, even though in a way it's more streamlined or focused than the first phase, which is a good thing, I think. Again, too many characters in the first phase, too many plot threads that existed for the sake of having plot threads. This second phase is more focused on one thing, if you will, but that one thing isn't as interesting as anything in the first phase. It's also, overall, introduced even more new characters after I just started to like and get into some of the first round of characters this time period had introduced. Plus the villains of this second phase, the Path of the Open Hand, I just don't really care about them at all so far. And so yeah, if you're someone who in general likes the new canon, maybe you like the sequels, you like most if not all of the shows, and you're wondering if maybe you're missing out on something by not reading all the books and comics, the answer to that question is no. Which isn't to say there hasn't been any good books or comics worth reading. In my last video, I even talked about how, yes, there are some good stories to be had and that are worth your time to read. But the problem is they apparently aren't worth the time of those who, again, write and direct the films and shows. They may borrow from these other sources of canon from time to time. That's how we got characters like Cobb Vanth and Black Chrysanthemum. But even in those cases, it's more just taking the idea of the character than taking the actual character. For example, Cobb Vanth does not have the same origin story in the Mandoverse that he did in the Aftermath trilogy where he first was introduced. And so if I were in charge of Lucasfilm, I'd reinstate the expanded universe and print less books and comics in the new canon to make them more special and consequential, if you will. I'd force my writers and directors on my shows and movies to, on some level at the very least, work with the writers of the books and comics to have some real and interesting level of interconnectivity between them, to make them feel like this is indeed the same universe, not that everything is always either reactionary or ignored, which is what happens now. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about all this. Do you read the books and comics, or do you have no interest in them whatsoever? And how relevant do you think they should be to the bigger picture? I'm not suggesting required reading, but do you think they should have a bit more meat on the bones, if you will? Also, you can ask a question for a future lightning response video. Just start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and fire away with your question. Whatever you choose to do though, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.